Ever get hooked on a story and just have to know how it unfolds? Well, we're diving into one of those today. It's about Kenya's economy, the IMF, and a research paper that's really stirring things up. So picture Kenya like a runner, right? Tons of potential. They're supposed to be winning this economic marathon, but something's off. Low growth, a currency that sounds good on paper but actually hurts their exports.
Yeah.
They're hitting all these roadblocks.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. And then into this already complicated picture enters the IMF, often seen as, the go-to for countries needing a bit of economic direction. Kenya gets a program with them back in 2021, hoping for a turnaround.
Makes sense, right? You call on the experts when you need them. Except there's this research paper by a group of Kenyan economists, and they're arguing that the IMF's program might actually be doing more harm than good. The title is a bit of a mouthful, but it really grabs you. And then floods. A critical macroeconomic assessment of IMF conditionality on Kenya 2021 present.
The paper's core argument is that the IMF totally missed the mark when diagnosing Kenya's economic woes, like going to the doctor for a sprained ankle, but they decide to treat you for a broken leg. The treatment doesn't match the actual problem.
Exactly. The researchers say the IMF was so focused on Kenya's debt that they missed the bigger picture, the need to jumpstart real, lasting growth. Instead of saying, hey, invest strategically, it was all about austerity, budget cuts, spending restraints, the whole shebang. So yeah, debt reduction is important, but this paper argues it shouldn't come at the expense of crucial investments that could actually help an economy thrive. And here's the kicker. The IMF's own track record of predicting Kenya's debt to GDP ratio. Not exactly stellar. Their projections have been all over the map, which makes you wonder if they're basing these recommendations on solid ground.
It definitely raises questions. If the IMF can't even get their own projections straight, how can they be so sure about the solutions they're prescribing?
And while we're on the topic of things not quite adding up, let's talk about Kenya's currency, the shilling. The paper claims it was seriously overvalued. Now, I know a strong currency sounds like a good thing, but...
It's not always what it's cracked up to be.
Right. It's like we were talking about earlier, that cup of Kenyan coffee suddenly costing twice as much as its Brazilian counterpart. An overvalued shilling makes Kenyan exports way pricier, putting them at a real disadvantage globally. And the paper suggests that, get this, the IMF's austerity measures might have actually prevented a natural correction of the shilling, keeping it artificially high.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
Well, we've got this potential misdiagnosis of Kenya's economic issues, this currency puzzle, and oh yeah, remember those external shocks we were discussing earlier?
Oh,
Unexpected stuff that can throw even the best plans off track.
right, those global curveballs. Well, one of the biggest was the global food price crisis, and that hits developing nations especially hard.
And this paper does not mince words when it comes to the IMF's response, or lack thereof. And, when you factor in that global food price crisis, things in Kenya get even more complicated. This paper really goes after the IMF, saying their response just didn't cut it, that it didn't protect vulnerable Kenyans from those price shocks.
It's those moments, isn't it, when the theory hits the road, so to speak. When global food prices go crazy, it's the poorest households that feel the squeeze the most. We're talking about families already spending a huge amount of their income just to get food on the table.
Exactly. It's like telling someone to budget better when the price of bread has doubled overnight. It's almost impossible. And the paper actually gives this really stark statistic. The relative price of food in Kenya shot up by 30%.
30%. Just imagine what that does to families barely scraping by. And the paper's point is that the IMF, with all its talk of austerity, didn't really do anything to soften that blow. If anything, they argue, that push for a tight fiscal policy might have actually made inequality worse, pushing the poor citizens even further down.
Which seems kind of backwards, right? Like the whole point of going to the IMF is to get help stabilizing your economy, not to throw things further out of whack.
And of course, the IMF would probably counter that sometimes you've got to make tough choices, short-term pain for long-term gain and all that.
Right, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
But the question here is, who's feeling the pain? This paper suggests it was mostly those least able to cope, while those long-term gains are debatable, to say the least. Which brings us to another big criticism the paper raises. The sheer number of conditions the IMF slapped onto their program with Kenya.
Ah, yes, the infamous IMF conditionality. It's a bit like ordering a coffee and being told you have to eat a 3-course meal first.
Exactly. You want one thing, but you get the whole enchilada whether you like it or not. So, for those who aren't familiar with this, the IMF often attaches these conditions to their loans, changes to policy reforms, things like that.
And in theory, it's supposed to make sure the money is being used responsibly, that the country's actually tackling its economic issues.
Right. A bit of tough love from the financial advisor, so to speak.
Mhm.
But the paper argues that in Kenya's case, the IMF went completely overboard with those conditions. They actually call it a Christmas tree of conditionality.
Kind of a funny image, but it makes the point. The paper highlights that the IMF itself, informally, says you shouldn't have more than 10 conditions per program. Kenya had 36.
36 conditions.
Ah.
That's more conditions than there are days in a month.
A bit overwhelming, I imagine, and that's exactly what the paper argues, that this much conditionality can actually backfire.
Because it's like trying to study for a huge exam while juggling 5 different things at the same time. Something's got to give. So if
Yeah.
you're a country already facing tons of challenges and then you get hit with this avalanche of conditions,
Well, the paper suggests it can really stifle a country's economic autonomy, make it harder to set their own priorities. Imagine running a marathon while someone's constantly adjusting your shoelaces and headband. It's distracting, it's annoying, and it's going to slow you down.
and for Kenya, it seems like all those conditions didn't exactly get the results they were hoping for.
Not really, no. Even though the Kenyan authorities tried hard to meet those IMF conditions, their economic situation stayed pretty fragile. And we have to remember, this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about real people's lives, their ability to make a living, their futures.
Which brings up the obvious question. If the IMF's program wasn't really doing its job, what's the alternative? The good news is this paper doesn't just criticize. It offers some solutions.
It does, and some of them are pretty bold. So let's dig into those alternative paths forward and what a real reset for Kenya's economic marathon might actually look like.
So we've talked about the critiques this paper has about the IMF program in Kenya, the misdiagnosis, the currency issues, that global food crisis we talked about, and all those conditions. But let's switch gears a bit. What does this paper offer as an alternative?
Well, they don't hold back. They come right out and say Kenya needs a major cut to interest rates. This, they argue, could really get the economy moving again and help fix that overvalued shilling we were talking about.
That makes sense. Lower interest rates often encourage borrowing and investment, right? But wouldn't that also risk higher inflation? How do they address that?
That's where their next recommendation comes in. They propose a more, shall we say, nuanced approach to debt management. They suggest looking into things like restructuring the debt or even, get this, debt forgiveness.
Wow, okay.
Their thinking is this could free up resources that Kenya desperately needs for crucial things.
Things like,
Infrastructure, education, healthcare, basically, the building blocks for long-term sustainable growth.
so it's about shifting the focus from just paying back debt to actually investing in a more prosperous future. What I find really interesting is how the paper doesn't forget about the human side of all this. They keep circling back to the people hit hardest by the food price crisis.
I agree. They really emphasize the need for targeted support to help those most affected by those skyrocketing prices. Remember that 30% jump we talked about? Those families need help now. And the paper stresses that a real economic recovery can't leave anyone behind.
It's about making sure economic progress includes everyone. You know, it strikes me that this paper isn't just about Kenya, is it? It makes you question the role of big institutions like the IMF in a world that's, well, increasingly complex.
It definitely goes beyond just one program, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's calling for a fundamental shift in how we think about global economic development. The authors want to see a system that puts people first, not profit. A system that empowers developing nations to chart their own course. And one that recognizes that every country faces unique challenges.
It's a bold vision, and it really challenges that top-down approach we often see from organizations like the IMF. It begs the question, is the IMF, an institution designed decades ago, really equipped to handle the realities of today's world? We're talking about a globalized economy, climate change, rising inequality. These are complex issues that need flexible solutions, not a one-size-fits-all approach.
That's the million-dollar question this paper puts forward. And honestly, it's something we should all be asking ourselves. How do we create a global financial system that supports development that's genuine, inclusive, and sustainable?
A system that empowers, not burdens. It's a lot to consider, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some new ways to think about these issues. As the paper argues, the IMF, and really anyone working in international development, needs to do a better job of listening to the people they're trying to help. So we'll leave you with this question. What do you think needs to change to create a global economy that's more just and equitable for everyone? This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.